Old enough to remember when it was Republicans who were talking about freedom. It turns out now what they meant was the government should be free to invade your doctor's office. In Minnesota, we respect our neighbors and their personal choices that they make.
Back in 2020, at the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic, a former wine and bistro business owner, Lisa Hanson, was jailed for operating her business despite lockdowns. She initially obeyed, but the lockdowns persisted for months, which hurt her business. So she defied these shutdowns 6 times and was convicted with a maximum sentence of 90 days and a $1,000 fine. She blamed the governor of her state, Tim Walz, the current vice presidential candidate for the Democratic ticket in the United States. She is a grandmother of 19 children, which is quite ironic since one of the rough mottos for the lockdown orders was saving grandma from COVID.
Shutdown orders kept coming, and it soon became clear that she may not have a business if she follows that order. So between December 2020 and January 2021, she reopened her business on 6 different occasions. No one died, no one was hurt. She was just trying to take care of her family. For disobeying Governor Walz, she was fined $1,000 and sentenced to 90 days in jail.
We have great concern that his evil, orchestrated with Harris's evil, will destroy our country. Just like Walz destroyed Minnesota, has destroyed Minnesota, and so many businesses. My business is gone. My business was destroyed by Walz and Attorney General Keith Ellison.
But why is this important now? Other than Tim Walz being the vice presidential candidate? Well, I'll get to that. The US is currently facing a tough decision. Camel-toe Harris or Donald Drumpf? I personally do not envy the American people, whose potential leaders are more qualified as plus-size models than competent policymakers. And one of the least competent policies that these presidential candidates are spitballing is something called price controls, where the government controls the prices of selected goods and services. Meaning that, depending on the extent of these price controls, businesses have a limited ability to increase their prices, even in response to greater demand from consumers. Kamala Harris wants to bring price controls to America.
And I will work to pass the first ever federal ban on price gauging on food. My plan will include new penalties for opportunistic companies that exploit crises and break the rules.
Why? Because the US has been struggling with massive inflation in the past few years. This has created a rather popular perception that large corporations have been dramatically raising prices above their cost at the expense of the consumer, and pundits have been pointing to higher corporate profits. Never mind that there has been no strong correlation between company markups and inflation. Never mind that the high corporate profits were mainly due to large-scale government subsidies and stimulus packages during COVID. And never mind that inflation may more likely be explained by the massive printing in money, since various studies have shown that a rise in the money supply is strongly correlated with inflation. Regardless, these price controls were suggested as a way to combat the higher prices charged by companies. But price controls suck. If you are not sure why, then let me teach you a basic economics lesson. When a business is limited in increasing their prices, they may be in situations where there is a sudden demand for their goods and services, but they don't have enough stock. They would usually raise prices to discourage excessive consumption of their goods, and use the new enormous profits from the higher prices to raise production, since there is clear demand. But since a business can't raise prices much, their goods and services will run out, and they won't have much profit to build more production to increase their goods and services. Basically, price controls lead to a lower supply of goods and services, even if there are lower prices for consumers in the short term. There is an abundant literature in economics that show how price controls lead to lower supply, but I will go over that in the future, since the proponents of Kamala's price control policy are not even calling it price controls. In fact, many of them have criticized price controls for exactly this reason of hurting the supply of goods and services, but describe Kamala's policy as not really price controls. And there's a reason for this. You see, these particular price gouging laws that Kamala is referring to limit price increases to a certain extent of certain goods in a natural disaster, America unfortunately has a climate for natural disasters such as floods and hurricanes. Right now, Hurricane Helene and Milton sadly come to mind. And when disaster strikes, resources get destroyed, and people are demanding en masse vital goods and services like water, food, and medicine. The pressure of this high demand but limited supply forces businesses to raise prices dramatically during these natural disasters. Understandably, many don't want people to pay higher prices during crises like natural disasters. So 34 states created these so-called price gouging laws, where if a state announces an emergency, usually pertaining to a natural disaster like a flood, then these laws would be automatically activated. Some, like Cenk Uygur, have tried to play this policy as not really price controls, since they were already in use by American states, including the Republican ones, as a response to emergencies. The justification for why this anti-price gouging regulation isn't called price controls is apparently the following argument. Price controls don't work in normal times, as corporations have less bargaining power with consumers to set prices, but in times of disaster, such as a flood, hurricane, or pandemic, consumers will be rushing to stores to buy and stockpile supplies en masse from businesses. They are incredibly desperate, and because of this, corporations can set whatever prices they want by taking advantage of consumers' fear and desperation for basic necessities that are in short supply. They may also retort that companies have little incentive to increase supply in response to the higher profits/prices, since these emergencies are extremely temporary, so these price gouging laws shouldn't have the same effect of price controls reducing supply. This is the supposed distinction between price controls and Kamala's proposed policy. So for the rest of the video, I will call this emergency policy as price gouging regulation instead of price controls. Economists have pointed out various potential problems with these laws, such as shortages, greater consumer waiting, and higher consumer searches. But while there is great evidence for the case against price controls in general, there is not much comparative data on this particular anti-price gouging policy due to a lack of natural experiments. Sure, it was estimated that price ceilings resulting from the price gouging regulation would increase economic damages for 2 months after Hurricanes Rita and Katrina by between $1.5 and $2.9 billion, and that price gouging regulations decrease economic growth of the hurricanes. But there hasn't been much of an opportunity to test this at such a large scale across the various states. Well, up until the pandemic, the coronavirus has been mentally scarred in our collective psyche as a global disaster that took many lives and created mass panic. So when the COVID-19 pandemic struck, this was definitely considered an emergency. As mentioned before, this meant that 34 states automatically activated these price gouging laws, and 8 states also added these laws since they didn't have them previously in reaction to the pandemic. Therefore, we now have the opportunity to test this policy on a large scale of 42 states. If the price gouging regulation led to shortages, then consumers will search more stores, leading to more social contact. And why is social contact important? Because of the reason 42 states activated these laws in the first place. The pandemic was exacerbated by social contact, which encouraged lockdowns, like the ones mentioned earlier by Tim Walz. In a pandemic, consumers will be in a panic and buy en masse as well as stockpile. And this will be worsened by price gouging regulation causing shortages, which will make consumers buy more stuff and stockpile and cause more shortages, which will make consumers buy more stuff and stockpile and cause more shortages, which will make consumers buy more stuff and stockpile and cause more shortages and Okay, you clearly get the point. Basically, a self-reinforcing and vicious cycle. And this is what a study wanted to test. Whether the price gouging regulation caused shortages which increased social contact during the pandemic by comparing counties of the 42 states with price gouging regulation versus counties of the 8 states without price gouging regulation. Then again, even if the researchers discover greater social contact, it could be other factors that cause people to go outside more to other institutions than shops. So they accounted for this by differentiating between establishments that have vital goods, services, and necessities, which in this case would be groceries and pharmacies, as well as measuring social contact to parks. So if there is more people going to groceries and pharmacies, but not to parks, the hypothesis that the price gouging regulation caused shortages would be proven correct. They measured social contact by using the Device Exposure Index, or DEX, which measured the average exposure of mobile devices to each other by county and day. Now, the DEX only includes counties with at least 1,000 pinging mobile devices, and the researchers restricted the study to counties with less than 4,000 mobile pinging devices per square mile for comparability, which removes 20 counties. But even with this, that still represents 90.31% of the US population. And if anything, keeping these denser counties would mean that the estimated effects of social contact from price gouging regulation would be even higher. The researchers also used Google's county-level aggregated individual mobility data to check visits to grocery and pharmacies. But because Google's data needed a minimum amount with location data turned on, grocery and pharmacy visits account for 89.98% of the US population, while the park sample counties account for 70.89%. So when checking the exposure of mobile devices to each other and visits to groceries and pharmacies, the trends between counties with pre-existing price gouging laws and no existing laws are pretty similar. However, once there are emergency declarations, a massive gap between counties with price gouging laws and counties with no price gouging laws starts to form. This means the counties with price gouging regulations had more people going to pharmacies and groceries. But while there was also a gap in visits to park, this did not change significantly after emergency declarations, meaning both counties with and without price gouging regulation have similar levels of people visiting parks, which already provides solid evidence that price gouging regulation causes shortages, which incentivizes greater social contact. Also, if you're enjoying this content so far, please give a like and comment, as it really helps me in the YouTube algorithm. Anyways, there were also questions on whether pandemic controls of new cases, new deaths, and stay-at-home requirements affected social contact regarding price gouging regulation. Without pandemic controls, counties with price gouging regulation increased social contact by 38 or more contacts per device per day, and 6.7% greater pharmacy and grocery visits per day than in counties without price gouging regulation. But with pandemic controls, the effect was only a little smaller, as counties with price gouging regulation increased social contact by 37 or more contacts per device per day, and 6.5% greater pharmacy and grocery visits per day than in counties without price gouging regulation. In addition, while these grocery and pharmacy visits have positive signs, the estimated impact of price gouging regulation on visits to parks had negative and statistically insignificant signs. This means this greater social contact by people was concentrated in commercial establishments that sold goods and services due to price gouging regulation, even when accounting for the pandemic and visits to parks. Another curiosity is how strict these price gouging laws are, as in what percent will they allow the price of selected goods to increase. A lower percent would of course be stricter, so more strict price controls will theoretically cause consumers to buy more in groceries and pharmacies. But what about laws that do not mention a specific percentage? Just that the price rise is unconscionable or excessive. These laws are ambiguous, meaning it is subject to potential claims of violation. After all, previous research shows that ambiguous punishments are more likely to lead to compliance than certain ones. So the researchers treated these counties with ambiguous price gouging laws as operating under the strictest price rise threshold of 0%. When including the ambiguous counties in the sample, there was positive and significant impacts of stringency on grocery and pharmacy visits. But removing the ambiguous counties lead to positive but statistically insignificant or weakly significant results. This holds regardless of pandemic controls. So either these laws' effect do not differ much by severity, or that the counties with ambiguous price gouging laws are significantly more strict than counties with known price control severity. But these results persist regardless of new law counties, pre-existing laws, duration of exposure to laws, and different statistical methods. And if you're still somehow skeptical, American counties with price gouging regulation has significantly higher daily confirmed cases and daily confirmed deaths than American counties without price gouging regulation. Seriously, look at that graph. Look at it! It seems likely that price gouging regulation killed people, like maybe a grandma, which is ironic since the same people who advocated the lockdowns to save grandma also advocated for these price controls that encouraged greater social contact during the pandemic, which apparently led to greater daily confirmed deaths. People like Tim Walz, who is also Kamala's vice presidential candidate, so I'm pretty sure he is supportive of these price controls. So apparently Tim Walz wants to kill grandma, or at least the livelihood of one grandma in the case of Lisa Hanson. While I do have great sympathy for people suffering natural disasters, price controls during emergencies will lead to consumers overbuying, and this means less stuff for other consumers. It will still be unfair since it will just be the fastest consumer who gets what they want rather than the richest. At least when prices rise, it will slow down consumption and help producers to supply new goods and services, even in a crisis. It's also pretty weird that they would call a period of high inflation akin to a natural disaster or pandemic to justify these emergency price controls. But many left-wing economic policies have unintended consequences. Anyways, I hope you enjoyed this video. My friend The Political Checkmate also made a video on Kamala Harris regarding her supposed support amongst economists, which I recommend you guys give a watch. If you enjoyed my video, please give a like, comment, and consider subscribing for more future content. I'm gonna do another Kamala Harris video regarding her grocery store talking points. Thanks for watching and see you later. Bye.